Proportion of alleles. Many biologists define evolution by proportion of alleles, which are different forms of alleles in a population. Each individual has 2 copies of each gene, which are identical or the same. During sexual reproduction, each pair of genes gets passed on to the offspring as a 50-50 chance on what parent's genes gets passed on. In small populations, the proportion of different alleles can change over time. It is also possible for mutations to rise or fall because of random sampling. Genetic drift versus natural selection. A random change in frequency of genes over time is genetic drift. For example, the unusual frequencies of blood type in small communities that intermarry with each other. This causes rapid evolution by genetic drift. Drift is a random process, while selection gets rid of harmful alleles and raises the frequency of beneficial ones. Population size. Population size matters. In a large population, harmful genes are more likely to be lost. Mutations. Some mutations in a gene don't affect the gene sequence, so it doesn't affect the fitness of the individual. Changes in DNA sequence may reflect drift rather than selection. External features may also evolve from drift. Animal and plant breeding. Artificial selection. We know that breeders have successfully transformed plants and animals into completely different forms that are good for us to eat. This has been done by selecting a variation of genes. Another good example is a dog, a single species that comes in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. The difference between artificial and natural selection. Artificial selection is the intentional breeding of plants or animals. It is used to breed a species with preferred traits. Natural selection is the change of heritable traits in a population over time. Ancestral plants. It would be difficult to identify ancestral plants compared to today's plants. An ancestral tomato only weighed a few grams compared to a modern tomato, which can weigh up to 2 pounds. Wild cabbage has given rise to 5 different vegetables: broccoli, domestic cabbage, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, and cauliflower. Domestication of wild species took place only in a short period of time. Darwin knew it wouldn't be a stretch for people to accept natural selection.
We can use the laboratory to our advantage by controlling the environments in which we allow bacteria to grow in and what variants we want to select for. Bacteria is the favored vector because it can divide once every 20 minutes, allowing us to see thousands of generations in an extremely shorter time period. We can observe evolutionary change that exhibits variation, heritability, and the differential survival and reproduction of variants. Lenski tested E. coli for its ability to adapt under a feast and famine environment. He would deplete the amount of glucose fed to the organisms and then replenish it the next day. Lenski discovered over the course of 8 years, which is 40,000 bacterial generations, that E. coli mutated to adapt to the new environment, allowing it to evolve even faster than the original strains. Hall's study also looked for E. coli's ability to mutate. He deleted a gene in the bacteria which was used to break down lactose into food, and then placed the bacteria in an environment of lactose as its only food source. Originally, the bacteria depleted in numbers due to its inability to break down the lactose, but eventually they saw an increase in the numbers. They discovered E. coli mutated an enzyme originally not used to break down lactose and mutated it for that use. As time passes, the bacteria was more efficient at using the new enzyme and was able to produce twice as much enzyme to break down twice as much lactose. Another mutation allowed E. coli to intake lactose more easily. These experiments proved 2 important lessons. Bacteria can adapt to its environment successfully with the use of natural selection to promote evolution of its biochemical systems. Secondly, it shows these are not new traits that have been produced. Rather, they are adaptations to current processes that are already in place within the bacteria. Bacteria's short generation time makes them very advantageous to study in the lab, but it makes them very disadvantageous when it comes to their ability to mutate and produce antibiotic resistance in a short time period. Therefore, all surviving bacteria will be antibiotic resistant, bringing a F2 generation that is also drug resistant. This evolution of the microbe causes us to be back in the same situations we were before we had antibiotics. This leaves us in an arms race against the bacteria. The bacteria create resistance against one drug, so the pharmaceutical company creates a new drug to combat that resistance. But we find the bacteria keeps evolving and becomes more and more resistant. Resistance goes beyond bacteria. Insects have also gained resistance to many pesticides. Weeds have also adapted to herbicides. A lucky select few evolved to continue to thrive in their environments. Natural selection is an incredibly slow process, and we cannot accept to see large macroevolutionary changes in plants or animals during our lifetime. We can expect to see some small changes in features or microevolution. Stabilizing selection shows that there is an optimum size and that there will be a selection against what doesn't fit in the average body size. For example, human babies show that a baby born at 7.5 pounds is more likely to survive infancy than a lighter or heavier baby. Scientists can predict direction of which evolution will occur. Such on the Galapagos Islands, there was a drought, leaving only large hard seeds. Seeing as only bigger birds with stronger beaks could break these seeds, it was predicted that there would be a decline in the population size of the smaller ground finch, who ate only smaller, softer seeds. Over time, there was a 10% increase of the average beak size. As also seen in plants, it was predicted during a prolonged drought, natural selection would select for plants that flower earlier than their ancestors, allowing the plants to produce seeds quickly before the next drought, so they would leave descendants.
Last but not least, can selection build complexity? It is easy to accept the slight morphological changes such as the beak length of a bird, but what about more complex structures and processes that certain organisms possess? Examples such as blood clotting, which requires a synchronized ballet of proteins to all work together in the blood simultaneously to close wounds, or the ability of the giraffe to move its neck up and down without blood rushing to the head via a complex valved vasculature system, are cited as too complex to be molded and produced by selection. Even the human eye, despite the millions of people that are prescribed prescription glasses every year, me included, is cited as something that is too complex for a thoughtless mechanism such as natural selection to have created. But what other alternative do critics present? Intelligent design is a form of creationism that suggests supernatural design is responsible for these complex feats that natural selection is supposedly incapable of. Supernatural processes cannot be the subject of science, and intelligent design for the most part is unscientific due to untestable claims such as these. However, with each new discovery made and each new mystery solved in science, we slowly begin to shed more light on the previously unknown, which leaves less and less room to believe that complex features of organisms are merely whims of a supernatural designer. It is impossible to completely reconstruct past events. We simply weren't there when life began, or to witness the crucial moment that directed evolution in a certain route some time before. However, by simply showing that something is feasible, that is to say, an evolutionary precursor to complex traits that ultimately benefit the possessor each step along the way, we can effectively show that such a process is, in fact, feasible. For example, the pathway of blood clotting in vertebrates is incredibly complex, utilizing a 16-step cascade reaction that coalesces into a fibrin-reinforced clot that seals the open wound from the environment and effectively stops bleeding. Although we don't have all the details worked out, there is evidence of an adaptive, simpler precursor to fibrinogen that had a previous function in another organism and had evolved into a suitable protein for clotting in vertebrates. Sea cucumbers and vertebrates had a common ancestor approximately 500 million years ago. They possess a protein that is not used to clot blood, but is closely related to fibrinogen structurally. In the evolution of vertebrates, this would be considered a pre-adaptation in its early stages of evolution. Also, artificial selection can also be utilized to demonstrate that natural selection's ability to change is a very slow process when compared to rates of change in the lab. This shows us the appreciation one must have for how long it takes for these changes to actually occur. Which brings us to our next argument. Another famous example that proponents of intelligent design like to bring up is the human eye. What use, if any, is half an eye? Darwin, in his piece, The Origin, specifically answered this question by pointing to already existing species that had less complex eyes, as well as formulating a potential developmental pathway in which each version of the eye would confer benefits to its possessor, such as being able to find food, avoid predators, and assess its own environment. Thus, the argument that natural selection could never produce an eye falls apart instantly and really contains no validity. To end, natural selection is the cause of all adaptive evolution. To really understand and appreciate the power this mechanism has, we must extrapolate the small changes we observe in our lifetime over the millions of years it has had to cause change on all life in the world. Ultimately, this presents the most important lesson of Darwinism. Weak forces operating over long periods of time create both large and dramatic change. The end.